your Bibles, we are in the Song of Solomon. There are, my estimation, unless something drastic changes, there are 2 lessons left. That is tonight and potentially a week from tonight if things go to plan as I anticipate them anyway. Song of Solomon, start here in chapter 3. We're talking about the nature of marriage, understanding marriage. In Ephesians chapter 5, don't necessarily turn there, I'm only going to reference it. In verse 22 and following, we've referenced this a couple of times already. Paul, he assumes an understanding of marriage when he makes reference to it in connection to the relationship between Christ and the church. He's drawing from something you should understand as far as how marriage is supposed to work to the relationship between Christ and the church, because that was one of the first times that such a thing would be done. Now, we noticed this morning, John the Baptist makes reference to some degree to it when he talks about himself being the friend of the bridegroom, that is, the best man, effectively. And there are a few references along the way, but by and large, Paul deals with this in a pretty magnanimous way. And it's a wonderful comparison between the responsibilities of a husband and wife to one another, and comparing that to the responsibility of the church to Christ, and how Christ has instituted and brought forward that relationship and effectively dealt with it appropriately. In Revelation, John, the apostle, he refers to the church as the bride of Christ. So understanding marriage, not only from an Old Testament perspective, and not only from a patriarchal perspective, but also from a Christian perspective, we need to reconcile this, and we need to understand what marriage is, separated from the cultural stigma that is placed on it. Now, there are some things that are important to understand culturally, but marriage, in the case of what marriage is and how it was instituted and how it should be upheld, is not up for discussion. It's not up for cultural debate. What marriage is a biblical concept that goes back to Genesis, back to the very beginning of man. But here, what we have here is a very interesting thing. Here in Song of Solomon, chapter 3, if you look with me in verse 6, we've just left behind this evening that the Shulamite has had, distressed over the situation, because it feels like to her, in her dream, her love has left, or is no longer somewhere that she can find them. And in verse 5, it says again, I charge you, O daughters of Jerusalem, by the gazelles or by the does of the field, do not stir up nor awaken love until it pleases or until it's appropriate. And in verse 6, we have this very different thing. It's almost like she gets cold feet. And when do you get cold feet? Generally right before something important happens or something major happens. And that's exactly what it seems like is happening, because look at verse 6. He says, Who is this coming out of the wilderness, like pillars of smoke perfumed with myrrh and frankincense, with all the merchant fragrant powders? Behold, it is Solomon's couch, with 60 valiant men around it, and of the valiant of Israel. They all hold swords, being expert in war. Every man has his sword on his thigh because of fear in the night. They are there to protect something. And they are coming out to Lebanon, to the home of this Shulamite. Remember, she lives in Lebanon. There it says in verse 9, of the wood of Lebanon, Solomon the king has made himself a palanquin, which is a platform, effectively. You've probably seen movies that use things like this. Many emperors and kings, people who were important or treated as important, would sit on this platform and people would carry it. And there would be posts in it in order for them to carry it, usually on their shoulders. In this case, it's surrounded by 60 valiant men. So whatever is going to be in it, because there's nothing in it yet, whatever is going to be in it is of utmost importance to Solomon, and he wants to make sure that it arrives at its destination safely. He made its pillars of silver, its supports of gold, its seat of purple, its interior paved with love by the daughters of Jerusalem. Go forth, O daughters of Zion, and see King Solomon with the crown with which his mother crowned him on the day of his wedding, the day of the gladness of his heart. What is marriage? In this context, it is not only the ceremony, but the beginning of something incredible. And in this case, what she is describing from effectively, I don't know, a balcony or from her window, depending on what kind of shanty she lives in with her mother. But she is currently in her mother's house, and she sees out of the woods come this incredible procession. And understanding culturally what's taking place, Solomon has sent his platform, his palanquin, out to get his beloved and to transport her safely to Jerusalem, because there is an event coming. It's going to be their wedding. And as they approach, even she's looking around and she sees the, to be fair, opulence, the incredible nature of this platform, of this couch that is for her comfort, that is designed to help her relax and be calm, and is surrounded by his most valiant men, so that they might arrive at their wedding, or that she might arrive at their wedding safely. What we have here is what would be considered culturally at this time a pretty elaborate but effective wedding celebration, or on the way to the wedding celebration. And in most cases, as you see, even during Jesus' day, you had wedding feasts, and sometimes they would last a week. They would be an entire week of celebrating the love between these two individuals. And along the way, the ceremony would take place depending on, again, cultures change, not only within the culture of the world, but ultimately even within Israel. The ideals on what would be done in respect to the marriage ceremony and the feasting that would take place is varied. But the one universal truth is that these two individuals are leaving who they used to be behind. And as you see there in Genesis chapter 2, they leave their father and mother and they cleave to their spouse, and the two shall become one flesh. They leave. Notice the primacy of the relationship. You are bypassing what responsibilities you had, at least in the extreme. You still have responsibilities to, if your mother loses her husband, then you have a responsibility to take care of her, to take care of your parents, to honor them and respect them, but not in the same way as before. Now you have the primacy of your responsibility, and your relationships is going to be God and then your spouse. And no longer do your parents fit in that high. Now they are somewhere on the list, usually under your responsibilities, and we usually categorize it God, and then your wife or husband, and then your children, and then usually your immediate or your semi-immediate family, and your responsibilities to take care of your widow or whatever the case might be. But this leave is a really, really integral part of the relationship. And even in marriage ceremonies today, we emphasize that. Now, sometimes to the detriment, we emphasize a certain category of it. We put all of the emphasis on the bride. And sometimes even husbands or grooms inadvertently do that. Now, that's not to say the groom has to have a hand in everything. But sometimes when he shows no interest in it, the bride gets the wrong idea. Because this day and these things are actually supposed to, even culturally, put the emphasis on the couple as a separate entity from anything else. Which even look at the symbology of the ceremony that we have and the ceremonies that they would have had. The separation between the two individuals and how far and how wide it is from anyone else. It puts them oftentimes up on a platform in front of everyone. And it is a declaration not only of the love between these two individuals and the commitment between these two individuals, but also the importance or the primacy of the relationship between these two individuals. And when that is lost, marriages fail. When you get wife or husband somewhere they don't belong, that is to say, in your elevation of importance. When you get it above God, marriages fail. But when you get it below where it should be, marriages fail. And they fail in some incredible ways. The efficacy of most marriage ceremonies pushes for the union between these two individuals, severing the ties that previously bound them familially. And we have that in ours oftentimes by the father of the bride handing her off. And some people make a huge deal of this isn't a level of possession, and it's not. It's a symbol of what's taking place, that we as parents are no longer bound to her in the same way we used to be. But leave is not the only aspect. Cleave is the second part. Cleave means to stick like glue. In Matthew chapter 19 and verse 6, he says, "Therefore, what God has joined together, let no man separate." And what happened with Solomon? As he moves forward in his relationships with the world, and he builds and develops diplomacy with the nations around him, he collects wives. And we see that this relationship that should have been in a level of primacy, second in the world of all of Solomon's kingdom and all of Solomon's world, his wife should have come effectively second. God first, and his wife second. And when he fails to do that, what happens to this relationship? What happens to Solomon in general? He begins to fail as a human being, as a person who is working for God. In Matthew 19:6, "Therefore what God has joined together, let no man separate." And he goes on, you leave, you cleave, and the two become one flesh. That's a metaphorical concept, but it's also implied a physical concept, a sexual relationship. That these two people not only are leaving and cleaving, they cleave to such a degree that they effectively become one person, one entity, one organization that moves forward, unified in their cause. But there is also a physical nature in this. That when Adam knew his wife Eve, they conceived, and she bore him a son. And such has happened from then on for the furtherance of humanity. There is also in the nature of marriage a public proclamation. Notice it here. Very obvious public proclamation that takes place. The same happens in ceremonies today. And people argue, especially when you see marriages in other cultures, in other countries, in other places, and they say, well, that's not a marriage. Well, that's not a marriage ceremony. Where's the ring? Where are the people that are all dressed up? Where is the building where they're going to meet? And they don't say the same things that you're supposed to say with a marriage. Well, that's cultural. We have determined culturally as a group, not necessarily us, but it's been carried forward by other people who have determined what a marriage ceremony is supposed to look like. But what you notice throughout the history of the world ultimately, and throughout the Old Testament, both patriarchal and the Mosaic covenant especially, is a public proclamation. A public proclamation. It is the idea of keeping things above board. There is some form of ceremony, and sometimes it's whatever it means culturally. It can be as little as announcing your intentions to marry this other person and entering their tent and consummating the marriage. There are places that is it. But notice there's a public proclamation. We're not talking about cohabitation. That's not what they're referring to. They effectively are married in the eyes of the people around them, in their understanding. And this kind of thing, this ceremony, however large or small it is an important thing. It's more important than many might think. It's about keeping things above board. We're not just in an element of cohabitation. We're going to make sure that however the culture understands it, we have established our focus, right? We have made sure that the people around us understand the commitment that we're making. And it looks different in every place you go. In all cultures, and if you go back in time, it would look different back then than it does now. The importance, again, is that public proclamation, whatever that means. Governmentally, Romans chapter 13 and verse 1, governmentally, let every soul be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and the authorities that exist are appointed by God. Going back to cohabitation, people say, oh, we're effectively married. They say that paper doesn't mean anything. Well, governmentally it does. And if we're going to abide by the government, if that's the call that Paul makes to all of us in regard to everything, that we are capable of enduring the boundaries the government places, if we want to be married, then we need to be married by the law, regardless of what that law constitutes. In some places, there is no law concerning marriage. It is, again, simply a public proclamation. There's no paperwork. The government doesn't care. But here in this country, the government does care, and in order to be married legally as well as biblically in this case, you got to respect the governmental position on marriage and respect your responsibility to take care of that. cohabitation is not the same thing. When we're dealing with things like this, Trisha deals with adultery in young classes, and you say, well, that's weird. It's the 10 Commandments. How far you got to go before you hit one that's real awkward? Not far. Adultery is right there. And the kids always ask, well, what's adultery? It's a normal question. So you're supposed to just skip over it or tell them that to ask when they're older. That's awkward. And that's uncomfortable for the kids. It doesn't make any sense. And they're going to... So what does she say? Two people who aren't married living together like they are. That's adultery. And that is a 3, 4, 5, 6-year-old answer to it. An answer that is entirely suitable for them and entirely meets the qualifications of truth. And it works for these young people. And many of them, they go, okay, that makes sense. And that's important, that they understand the problem here is not as small as we might think. Getting kids to understand adultery is hard. Getting adults to understand adultery shouldn't be that hard. And yet, why is it? Why is it so hard for people to understand the confines of marriage within the boundaries of God? Well, they don't respect God. They don't respect what God is and what God communicates. And we run into another problem. Again, we've talked about it to some degree before. We'll talk about it slightly today. People are uncomfortable with the idea of marriage, specifically sex within marriage. That word gets people very angry or upset. And what's happened is they have turned, unfortunately, attempted to turn the Song of Solomon into an allegory. And by that I mean it's representative. It is not describing, according to these people, it is not describing Solomon and the Shulamite woman. They are merely actors in a play that really represents Christ and His church. Now that's a really odd way of getting around the issue of sex, especially when you start reading the Song of Solomon. In chapter 6, in verse 4, this actually is recorded twice. So if you, as women, because this is the beloved to the Shulamite, this is Solomon writing to his beloved. And if these aren't compliments, I don't know what are. He says there in verse 4, "Oh, my love, you are beautiful as Tirzah, lovely as Jerusalem, awesome as an army with banners." That's amazing. "Turn your eyes away from me, for they have overcome me." He's getting better. "Your hair is like a flock of goats." There it goes. "Your hair is like a flock of goats." No, keep going. "Going down from Gilead." 6 is the best. "Your teeth are like a flock of sheep, which have come up from the washing. Everyone bears twins, and none is barren among them." What in the world? No, it's about their teeth being white, and they're in rows. That is, the top one has a matching set on the bottom. They are all with, and they're all amazing. And he is just like a shepherd would be. If you had a field full of sheep that were all pregnant, you would think that is the greatest. And if you're a king, an army with banners, do you have enough army to warrant having banners? It's not like you got 8 guys and they all standing there with banners. You're talking about an army that needs banners. That's an amazing thing to him, a beautiful thing, you might say. And he compares her to that, and it goes on. "There are 60 queens, or 7, like a piece of pomegranate, are your temples behind your veil." Her rosy, we'd say rosy cheeks, but he's talking about her temples around the side of her head. In 8, "There are 60 queens and 80 concubines and virgins without number. My dove, my perfect one, is the only one of her mother, the favorite of the one who bore her. The daughters saw her and called her blessed, and the queens of the concubines, and they all praised her." Generally, when you're talking about your spouse, you don't include people of ill repute. You just leave that comparison out. But he throws it in there because Solomon would know. In verse 10, "Who is she who looks forth as the morning, fair as the moon, clear as the sun?" So he's doing really well. And then he goes right back to this army with banners thing. But it makes sense to her. And she is enraptured by this. Right? Go to chapter 7 and verse 1. "How beautiful are your feet in sandals, O prince's daughter. The curves of your thighs are like jewels. The work of your hands, of the skillful workman, your navel is around a goblet. It lacks no blended beverage. Your waist is a heap of wheat set about with lilies. And you can keep going. He talks about other aspects that she possesses, and he is enamored by her, as he should be, as a man who has found a woman who is not only attractive, but fills his heart with joy. That she is what he considers his fulfillment in life. If this is allegory, what in the world does all that mean? I gotta say, that's kind of messed up. And yet, why do we go there? Why do people try to make this leap, to make it allegory, when it is so obviously a love letter between Solomon and his love? Are we not okay with that? Are we not okay that this is the case? And that married love is a beautiful and wonderful thing? And the answer is no, we're not okay with that. Because intimacy in any form makes us uncomfortable. It makes things awkward. But notice Paul's warning in 1 Timothy chapter 4. 1 Timothy chapter 4, there were a number of people, even in Paul's day, that felt like intimacy was a difficult thing to cover, a difficult thing to deal with. And so what did they argue? In verse 1, 1 Timothy chapter 4 and verse 1, now the Spirit expressly says that in latter times someone will depart from the faith, giving heed, notice this, to deceiving spirits and doctrines of demons. So as he moves forward, that's what he's talking about. But you know how people are. They will rip passages right out of the Bible and they won't think twice about their context. Keep that in mind. These are doctrines of demons. He says, speaking lies and hypocrisy, having their own conscience seared with a hot iron. What's that first one in 3? Forbidding to marry. Paul says this was something that they taught at the time. That people were spreading around that you shouldn't get married. And Paul says that's ridiculous. That is a doctrine of demons. That is departing from the faith, and he warns about these things. There are extreme consequences, and we've seen them recently revealed in this Inquisition in the Catholic Church. But it's been seen for a very, very long time. The congregation's leadership should be married. An elder is to be the husband of one wife. The leadership of the church is intended to be married. That will not solve all these problems, but it certainly keeps a lot of these things from happening. And they ignore Paul's warnings. There are denominations, and I would throw the Catholic Church in that word, because it's a denomination of what's presumed to be Christianity, though it's not. And you have this issue where priests are not allowed to marry, but in the past they were. Now who decides that? It's not God, because God doesn't change. It's the Pope and the cardinals and the people. When they came to a situation where they didn't have a priest, they said, well, we better lower the qualifications. And what happens when you take extreme stances like this against things that God has told you not to take extreme stances against? You run into problems. Some condemn married people using any contraception at all, even abstinence. And they point to Onan in Genesis chapter 38. Judah has a son. He actually has a few sons. But is given in marriage to one named Tamar. Genesis chapter 38, verse 6. Judah took a wife for his firstborn, and her name was Tamar. But Judah's firstborn, was wicked in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord killed him. So before they were able to conceive a child that would be the product of and a future lineage, a future descendant of Judah, God's wrath against came upon him, and he was killed. And Judah said to Onan, his second son, go into your brother's wife and marry her and raise up an heir to your brother. That was the intention. You're to marry her and you're to impregnate her so that she bears a child, but that child will not necessarily be yours. It will in fact be your brother's. He will inherit your brother's land, the stock that your brother has. But Onan, look at this, verse 9, Onan knew that the heir would not be his. And it came to pass when he went into his brother's wife that he emitted on the ground, lest he should give an heir to his brother. Now they would say that the simple act of such a thing is the issue. I argue the defiance is the issue. The issue is that he didn't like the idea of having to raise his brother's child and giving away his firstborn in order to take care of his brother. And that made God angry, so what do you think God did? And the thing which he did displeased the Lord, therefore he killed him also. Now what displeased God? Was it the actual act that Onan performed? Or was it his intention behind that activity? It was to deny Judah a grandchild through or whatever. And that's the issue. And yet people will point to Onan and say, well, he spilled his seed on the ground, and that's why he died. So you shouldn't. Even abstinence, right? There are a number of reasons, purposes of sex within the confines of marriage. I can't emphasize that enough. Within the confines of marriage, there are a great deal of purposes. First and foremost, obviously, procreation. And this is what everyone argues. If you're going to have relations with a person, with your spouse, it should produce a child. That's absurd. In the past, Genesis chapter 1, verse 28, chapter 9, verse 1, what's the context of those two happenings? The two times God tells them to multiply and fill the earth, what has just transpired? First, there is not very many people. There are 8 people alive in Genesis 9. There are 2 people alive in Genesis, where'd it go? Genesis 1. In Genesis 1, there are 2 people alive. And later on, there could have been millions. And suddenly, in chapter 9, there are 8. So they have a responsibility to multiply and fill the earth. What have we done since then as a human race? We've done an okay job of that. Even to the degree that some people argue there are too many people in the world. Whatever. But the argument in this case, procreation for multiplicity purposes, does not make logical sense. Now to continue the species is an excellent thing. And to raise children is an excellent thing. And to procreate is a perfectly fine thing to do. But to take this stance and to say that it's necessary in every situation and that sex is only useful in the terms of procreation is to ignore the overarching theme that the Bible gives. For instance, 1 Corinthians chapter 7. Again, within the confines of, I don't know how many times I can say that. I can't say it enough. Within the confines of marriage, sex has its place. In 1 Corinthians chapter 7 and verse 1 he says, now concerning the things of which you wrote to me, it is good for a man not to touch a woman. And that is a general rule. He is making a general statement. It's interesting that he would make that statement. Verse 2, nevertheless, that's how you can know it's a general statement. There is an exception to the rule. He says, because of sexual immorality, let each man have his own wife, and let each woman have her own husband. Those terms are actually possessive. And he would go on to talk about the wife possessing the husband's body and the husband possessing the wife's body. And that's a physical consummation of marriage. That is a physical relationship that he's talking about. And why? Why should they do so? Because of sexual temptation. To avoid temptation, it's appropriate for them to involve themselves in the pleasuring of one another. He says in verse 5, do not deceive one another, do not deprive one another, except for consent for a time, that you may give yourself to fasting and prayer, notice this, and come together again so that Satan does not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. Go down to verse 9. But if they cannot exercise self-control, let them marry, for it is better to marry than to burn with passion. There are at least 2 reasons that a sexual relationship within the confines of marriage is not only appropriate, but important. Procreation and avoiding temptation. And then we turn to the Song of Solomon, and everything about the Song of Solomon suggests that it is for another purpose. And there's another place that does that. There's actually a couple. There's another purpose, fulfillment and enjoyment of the marital relationship. In Proverbs chapter 5, some of these metaphors they use are, from our context, kind of funny. In Proverbs chapter 5, in verse 15, and actually if you wanted to keep going from Song of Solomon chapter 7, if you were to keep going all the way to verse 10, you'd read more. And there are a few other places that do so. But in this case, we're going to stop there. Proverbs chapter 5 and verse 15, He says, drink water from your own cistern and running water from your own well. That sounds like an agricultural idea, but it's not. In verse 6, should your fountains be dispersed abroad? He says, don't share. That's not what he's talking about, but he does say don't share. Streams of water in the streets, let them be only for your own, and not for strangers with you. Let your fountains be blessed, and rejoice with the wife of your youth. There's the turn. He keeps going. As a loving deer and a graceful doe, let her breast satisfy you at all times, and always be enraptured with her love. For why should you, my son, be enraptured with an immoral woman and be embraced in the arms of a seductress? Why would you open yourself up to this temptation? So the second argument there. But more importantly, why would you avoid such a relationship that is available to you? Why would you avoid such enjoyment and fulfillment in life? The fact of the matter is, as we deal with the Song of Solomon, we're not going to deal with it quite so much in the future. The next one has another weird concept that we'll talk about next week if the Lord wills. But for now, when it comes to a sexual relationship, we need to understand that within the confines of marriage, sex is a gift from God, enjoyed to its fullness by those who are obedient to its intended use. Do not awaken desire, do not awaken love until it is appropriate, because it is a terrible mistress, or mister, depending on your perspective. It will drive you into a pit. It will bring upon you a legion of woes. But for those who use it correctly, for those who enjoy it within the confines of marriage, and who use it appropriately, according to its intended use by God, it is a gift. But it is by no means the greatest gift, obviously. We have the opportunity to talk about things like this, to talk about marriage. And for God, then, in the future, to use this concept of marriage and the joy that two people can have with one another, and the commitment that they can express, both from the beginning in the garden all the way forward into relationships, and we can see it develop, and we can see it blossom, and we can see it fail, because people don't put it in the right place. And the same goes for your relationship with God. Perhaps you have not put your relationship with God in the right place. It is a gift. The gift of God is eternal life. But it is not for everyone. It's to everyone, but not everyone will receive it. Those who are not willing to obey, as we talked about this morning, who are not willing to put Christ on in baptism, who are not willing to abide by His law and His way, are going to find that their relationship fails. And it fails miserably. And you do not want your relationship with God to fail at the worst possible time. Any time is the worst possible time, but any time is a bad time. But the worst possible time to find out that your relationship with God is a failure is when you enter the judgment. And how many across this world are going to go into the judgment thinking that they are right with God, and they're going to find out that they are not?